Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to our latest explainer, where we're taking on a genuinely massive idea. We are decoding general systems theory. Now, have you ever wondered if there's just a single grand unifying framework for all the sciences? You know, a way to connect physics, biology, psychology, and even the way you manage your office? Well, that is exactly what this theory attempts to do, and we're going to break it all down using the foundational texts that started the whole movement. To understand why general systems theory was even born, we kind of have to look at the problem it was trying to solve. Consider this quote from economist Kenneth E. Boulding. He described a terrifying Tower of Babel scenario in modern science. Because of hyper-specialization, we basically reached a point where physicists only talk to physicists and economists only talk to economists. The languages became so intensely specialized that the disciplines completely lost the ability to communicate with one another.
Which leads us to a pretty critical question. Are we losing the ability to understand the whole picture? By placing such an intense focus on fragmented, highly specific specialties, are we actually blinding ourselves to the universal patterns that govern literally everything around us?
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the scientific Tower of Babel, introduce general systems theory, and break down the rules of open systems. Then we'll scale the 9 levels of complexity, ask if organizations are like organisms, and finally, test the limits of that biological metaphor. Let's get into it.
Part 1. The Scientific Tower of Babel.
Part 2. Enter general systems theory. The real game changer came with biologist Ludwig von Bertalanffy, particularly with his 1968 book on the foundations and development of general systems theory. He proposed a massive shift in how we think. Instead of just looking at mechanistic, efficient causes, where A pushes B to make C happen, he said we need to look at the holistic behavior of organized wholes. He argued that there are models and laws that apply to generalized systems, entirely regardless of whether that system is a chemical reaction, a plant, or a human society.
And a massive pillar of this whole idea is the concept of holism. You've probably heard the phrase, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Well, in systems theory, a system is an entity where the interconnected relationships matter just as much as the individual parts themselves. You literally can't understand a system just by taking it apart and looking at the pieces. You have to look at the emergent properties that only happen when those pieces interact. It's like a giant puzzle where the final picture is entirely different from the individual cardboard shapes.
Let's move to part 3 and see how this builds. Rules of open systems.
So what are the universal rules governing these biological and physical systems? Well, the absolute crucial point is contrasting closed systems with open systems. A closed system has rigid, impenetrable boundaries. Because it cannot exchange energy with its environment, the second law of thermodynamics dictates it will inevitably move toward entropy, disorder, and ultimately, death. But an open system? It has permeable boundaries. It constantly exchanges matter, energy, and information with its environment, which allows it to adapt, grow, and maintain a steady state.
And that brings us to a wonderfully sci-fi sounding term, negative entropy. Living organisms literally feed on negative entropy. By importing resources, stuff like food, water, information, from the environment, open systems can actually arrest the decay of entropy. They use these resources to create even higher levels of organized complexity and maintain a dynamic equilibrium. If you cut an organism off from its environment, it becomes a closed system, and, well, it perishes.
When we map these core concepts out together, you can really see how an open system functions as a continuous input, transformation, output model. It takes resources in, transforms them, and exports them, all while utilizing feedback loops to maintain that steady state we just talked about.
So let's talk about those feedback and control mechanisms for a second. Cybernetics relies heavily on negative feedback, which is informational input that tells the system it's deviating from its goal so it can self-correct. Think of a standard thermostat. It senses the room is too cold, turns on the heat, senses it's warm enough, and then turns it off. It appears to have a purpose, but it's really just efficient mechanics. The source material shares a truly great example of a toy turtle, programmed to follow a line on the floor. When its battery gets low, it stops following the line, seeks out a power source, plugs itself in, and once it's recharged, it goes right back to the line. It perfectly mimics purposeful survival behavior entirely through mechanical feedback loops.
Then we have equifinality, and this is just absolutely fascinating. In a closed mechanistic system, specific initial conditions always cause a specific final state. But in an open system, you can reach the exact same final state from completely different starting points.
A classic example from the sources is Hans Driesch's experiment with sea urchin embryos. He actually bisected an embryo in its early stage. Mechanistically, you'd expect two half urchins, right? But instead, both halves developed into whole, perfectly normal sea urchins. It totally proves the remarkable, goal-oriented flexibility of open systems.
Part 4, 9 Levels of Complexity.
So how do we scale these concepts from a simple thermostat all the way up to human civilization? Well, Kenneth Bolden created this incredible hierarchy to organize our scientific knowledge. We start way down at level 1 with static structures, move up to clockworks, and then our thermostat control mechanisms at level 3. Level 4 is where life actually begins, with open systems like single cells, moving up through plants and animals. But notice the massive leap at levels 7 and 8. Humans use symbols, we understand history, we actually know our own mortality. And at level 8, human society, we aren't just biological organisms anymore. We occupy historical and social roles that completely outlast us.
Which brings us to Part 5, Are Organizations Like Organisms?
I want you to really think of your own workplace or school as we look at this. As Cast and Rosenzweig point out in our source text, it is extremely tempting to map the organs of a human body directly onto the departments of a modern corporation. It's a very intuitive biological metaphor. The management is the brain, the workers are the muscles, the supply chain is the digestive system. But relying too heavily on this physical model can actually be deeply misleading.
Because here is the absolutely critical difference. An organization consists of elements, meaning people, that have and can exercise their own independent wills. Does your company actually have a single will of its own, or is it just the complex, often really messy combination of the competing wills, goals, and desires of its employees? I mean, the cells in your liver don't go on strike because they disagree with the brain, but human employees certainly do.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the fundamental difference between the natural and the contrived. Natural organisms have parts that completely lack independent will, and they follow a strict, unavoidable biological life cycle of birth, maturity, and death. Human organizations, however, are contrived social systems. They're invented by us. They don't have natural lifespans. They are anchored together not by tissue and bone, but by what the authors call psychological cement, our shared attitudes, beliefs, and expectations.
Which takes us to our final section, Part 6, Limits of the Biological Metaphor.
This is the vital twist in our explainer. Because human organizations are contrived systems, they just don't behave like plants or animals. A social structure can come completely apart at the seams overnight if people lose faith in it. Conversely, because they're built on habits and beliefs, an institution like a university or a government can outlast the biological lifespans of its original human creators by hundreds of years.
And you know, this completely changes how we measure success. A biological system's only real evolutionary goal is survival, just perpetuating the species. But human organizations require an open-ended, multidimensional contingency view. Mere survival just isn't enough. We have to look at effectiveness on multiple levels: the environment, the organization as a whole, and the individual human participants inside it.
Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to take away from this explainer. If a biological system's goal is purely to survive, what is the ultimate goal of the social and corporate systems that we invent? We know they're made of psychological cement. So ask yourself, in your workplace, in your society, do we exist simply to serve and perpetuate the system, or does the system exist to serve us? It's a wildly complex question for sure, but thanks to general systems theory, we finally have a unified language to start exploring the answer.